I would like for you to take a moment to look around the room that you're in right now. What do you see? Chances are you see painted walls, lamps, televisions, carpets, and I know you see a computer or else you wouldn't be watching this right now. Now take a look at yourself. How many cell phones, iPods, cameras, printers, or vehicles do you own? Almost every item you see or can think of is a product of industry. Humans have a zeal for progression and innovation, which has led us through many pivotal revolutions through history, one of which being the Industrial Revolution, that has since drastically altered lives around the globe. The world now revolves around industry, supply and demand, extraction of resources, production, marketing, distribution, and consumption. All this new technology makes our lives easier and convenient, and life more exciting and enjoyable. But there is also a dark side to this new age that many turn a blind eye to. Hazardous waste is a consequence of industry's production of commodities and merchandise. These are wastes that you and I are a part of producing. They are the byproducts of the pharmaceutical industry, biomedical waste from medical centers, lead from paints and varnishes, toxins from glue and resins, carcinogens from televisions and laptops. The list goes on. Despite the health and environmental dangers of hazardous waste that has been known for decades, industry is still booming. So what happens to the waste that no one wants on their hands? Unfortunately, it ends up in the hands of the exploited, those who are not responsible for the production but bear the brunt of the issue because of their economic status. By the end of this presentation, you should be familiar with the global hazardous waste crisis, as well as the preface of events that necessitated attention and action to the issue. Action includes the Basel Convention in 1989, which sought to control the movement of wastes across country borders. But the issue is still thriving. The only way to bring this injustice to a halt is the ratification of an amendment known as the Basel Ban, which would ensure the producers of the waste are the ones bearing the consequences. The first major event that truly made hazardous waste a national concern is believed to be the Love Canal controversy of 1978. This was a case of leakage of underground hazardous waste barrels that had been buried years beforehand, which resulted in awareness and concern from the public. This case was followed by years of indiscriminate burial sites of toxic waste being brought to light, some of which containing unidentified chemicals, the outcome being unknown hazards and disposal protocol. The Washington Post published an article in 1980 stating that water shortages and pollution would be as big of a crisis in the 1980s as energy was in the 1970s. It was then that the hazardous waste problem created international public awareness. The issue continued to bloom as word spread of developed nations running out of landfill sites. In attempts to decrease the amount of waste entering landfills, governments tried to encourage companies to produce less, with strict environmental regulations on hazardous waste disposal, and a boost in disposal and liability costs. Instead, most industries just started searching for cheaper disposal alternatives. Some companies held themselves accountable and decreased their production of toxic waste. Companies struggled with no legal place to put their waste, so many turned to the illegal. This resulted in what were called toxic traders, who shipped their hazardous waste to unwarranted developing countries such as Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. These unsolicited ships would dump their waste indiscriminately, often mismanaging it, resulting in contamination of the air, water, and land, which put the inhabitants of that country in danger. Their health, resources, and very survival were at risk. In 1981, the U.S. was quoted as planning to dump in Sierra Leone and half a dozen other countries as part of their plan to, quote, export 1 million tons of hazardous waste annually for processing and dumping abroad, end quote. They also tried to eliminate U.S. protocol to notify importing countries of their shipments, but Congress disagreed. Unfortunately, there had yet to be an effective notification system, as communication was often lost or the system set in place was not followed. This is a clear example of the selfish outlook of developed countries' governments. However, the developed world soon started to realize that it would, quote, not be long before the people of the third world revolt against being treated as the garbage can of the advanced industrial world, end quote. And not long it was before toxic traders were exposed, and there was an eruption of international outrage. Newspapers began the whirlwind of reporting to reveal these travesties, and the Third World pushed for their rights. Summer of 1988, the Italian-chartered West German freighter Karen B was denied its illegal attempt at dumping its hazardous wastes on the shore of Nigeria. After 9 weeks of attempting to dump its 2,100 tons of hazardous waste on 6 European countries after its attempt with Nigeria, it finally returned home to Italy. Late summer of 1988, an African outcry of toxic terrorism resulting from the discovery of 4,000 tons of hazardous waste on their shore, believed to be from the Karen B freighter. September 1988. African countries began blocking any foreign hazard waste from Europe and America. The developing world was in need of some hope, and it finally came. The New York Times published an article in November of 1988 stating that the United Nations was preparing a treaty for the regulation of transboundary hazardous waste shipments. And the following year, on the 22nd of March 1989, 117 nations met together for the first ever international attempt to limit hazardous waste dumping in developing countries. The meeting concluded with 105 nations adopting the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal. The treaty was ratified in 1992. The Basel Convention is a global agreement created to regulate the uncontrolled movement of hazardous waste across borders through 3 objectives I'm going to outline now. 1. Minimizing the production of hazardous waste. This will be done by promoting environmentally sound management, which is defined as taking all practical steps to minimize generation of the waste, and strictly controlling its storage, treatment, reuse, recycling, recovery, and final disposal, all with the central goal of protecting human health and the environment. 2. Disposing of hazardous waste as close to the source of production as possible. This will decrease the risk of accidental spill during transportation and ensure costs are paid by the producers. Having to pay and keep the waste on homeland gives countries incentive to decrease production. 3. Reducing movement of wastes. At the time of the convention, the United Nations experts said that they know of no developing country with the means necessary to destroy hazardous waste safely. Efforts to implement the convention have been strategized on a decade-by-decade basis. Parties have already devoted time to the development of an efficient exporting system, which includes prior written consent and a movement document containing instructions on what to do with the waste from beginning to end. In the past decade, they have stressed enforcement of the treaty commitments, emphasizing active promotion of cleaner technologies, improving the 14 regional centers that aid the nations in proper implementation, and prevention of illegal traffic, example traffic without proper documentation or consent. In order to implement the convention, this issue needs to be tackled on a global and local level. For some, just the regulation of transboundary wastes is not enough. They want complete prohibition. The document that was created to completely prohibit transboundary movement of hazardous waste is known as the Basel Ban. The push to ratify this document is particularly advocated by Greenpeace, who believe that the convention is worse than doing nothing at all, because not only does it allow shipment still, but it, quote, legitimizes rather than prohibits the shipment of waste to developing countries, end quote. An opposing argument is that some developing countries are capable of recycling, so shipments should be allowed if the material is to be recycled. However, in reality, almost 90% of the waste is not recycled, and recycling is often used as a guise to shipping illegal waste. Years of push from Greenpeace and supporting countries paid off when the parties of the convention passed an agreement to ban all transboundary exports of waste from developed nations to the Third World. But the opponents of the ban soon argued that it was not legally binding unless it was an amendment in the convention treaty itself. So in 1995, the parties agreed to the Basel Ban becoming an amendment of the convention. But this issue still has a ways to come, as the amendment has yet to be ratified. In order to do so, it requires 130 signatures from the convention parties, and currently only holds 63. To ratify the ban is now more important than ever. It is needed to prevent damage to human health and the environment, and prevent waste generators from avoiding taking responsibility for their waste. Without the ban, industrialized countries will continue to externalize the cost. This means paying less to dispose of waste by shipping it to poorer countries that do not demand as much money for it, or, if transported illegally, not any money at all. Although shamefully discounted, it is difficult for some struggling third world countries not to take the hard currency that is offered to them, as human health and environmental safety are often overlooked when it comes down to receiving money for their very survival. The ban needs to be passed in order to remove situations that allow industrialized nations to bully the third world to succumb to their demands. Without the ban, the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer, and the waste produced is at risk of mismanagement. Developed countries are practicing pure negligence for human health and the environment by not signing the Basel ban, because it perpetuates the shipping of hazardous waste across to countries that are ill-equipped, resulting in environmental pollution of a catastrophic measure. Evidently, the Basel Convention has yet to truly have an impact on the global hazardous waste issue without ratifying the Basel ban. At the very least, developed nations should identify with the environmental integration and economic globalization that inevitably relay that very waste back to its source. In conclusion, not signing the Basel ban will perpetuate our sad history of human and environmental suffering, prolong environmental degradation, and incessantly remind us that it truly is a small world after all.